Begin with a few simple observations. The title, as you probably saw somewhere, is Prospects for Democracy. And to evaluate the prospects for democracy, we have to, first of all, carry out some kind of assessment of where the world is heading. That's the prospects part. And crucially, we have to decide what we mean by democracy, which is a term that is used in wide varieties of ways. If we look at the present scene, we find an apparent clash between doctrines that are widely and, in fact, proudly proclaimed, and social and political realities that appear to conflict with them very sharply. The leading doctrine is that the wave of the future is democracy and markets, a future for which America is the gatekeeper and the model. I happen to be quoting from the New York Times, but if you sample almost at random, you'll hear the same thing, more or less the same words. That's the doctrine. The reality is that the world, including our own society, is moving towards a more autocratic and absolutist structure. The scope of the public arena is narrowing, and the opportunities for popular participation in it are also declining. In short, the realities are that democracy is under attack. There are also parallel attacks on free markets, and there are expanding forms of market distortion. It's an interesting topic, but not tonight's topic, so I'll put it aside and keep to the question of democracy, the other half of the story. Well, I said that the doctrine and the realities are apparently in conflict. That is, the doctrine that the wave of the future is democracy and we're the gatekeeper and the model, and the reality, which I think is rather the opposite. Also, there's at least an apparent conflict, but in fact the conflict can be resolved, namely by attenuating the concept of democracy and reducing it to pretty much an empty shell, to various forms with little meaning. And I think that that's exactly what is happening. Of course, in that case, the doctrine will be true, and I think if we look, that's pretty much what we see. The same is true of the talk about markets, but again, I'll put that aside. Well, the currently prevailing concepts of democracy, which have been narrowing and becoming more restricted and impoverished over the years, democracy and liberty as well, these concepts would, I think, have utterly appalled someone like, say, Thomas Jefferson and other great figures of classical liberalism, for whom, incidentally, democracy and even liberty were part of something broader. They were part of the conception of a good society, which would be measured and evaluated by how well it freed individuals and their creative powers. It's to that end that democracy was considered an appropriate means. If we turn to a more modern period, I think that the currently prevailing and increasingly narrowing concepts of democracy would also have appalled contemporary thinkers, 20th century thinkers. For example, a crucial example is John Dewey, who was the greatest American social philosopher, and whose thought focused primarily on the problem of enriching democracy, which he understood pretty much in the classical sense. He incidentally was appalled by the narrowing of the scope of meaningful democracy, both in practice and in the rising democratic theories of his era, mainly the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the Wilsonian intellectuals who developed the progressive intellectuals of the Wilsonian period, who laid pretty much the basis for the modern form of the impoverishment and attenuation of democratic theory, helped out by the then rising fields of the academic political sciences. There's little doubt in my mind that Dewey, like Thomas Jefferson, would find today's scene, half century later, even more ominous and depressing. Well, these are pretty important issues in contemporary intellectual history, and they have very broad implications, and there's a reality beneath them that is even more portentous. These are very large topics. They're actually topics for an ongoing seminar, not for a talk. I'll try to say a few words about them, but they're going to be inadequate, I'm afraid. To begin with, notice that just about every society calls itself, contemporary society, calls itself democratic. Actually, every contemporary society also calls itself egalitarian. The question is, equality of what? As is discussed in an interesting book by Harvard economist Amartya Sen that came out recently. So in our doctrinal system, we're supposed to insist upon equality of opportunities, one particular form of equality. Others call for other forms of equality. I stress our ideology. The reality is something else, as usual. Take, say, the old Soviet Union. The old Soviet Union consisted of countries that were called people's democracies, and in fact described themselves as the highest form of democracy. Well, we laugh at that for good reasons, and it's useful to have a look at the reasons. It's not that they didn't have elections. In fact, they did have elections. They could have even made the elections free in the sense that anybody who wanted to could say, I'm a candidate, and could even be listed on the ballot. Nothing significant would have changed. The reasons were several. The primary reason was that the basic decisions, the most important decisions about how the society worked, were not in the public arena at all. So it didn't matter much who voted and who ran. The basic decisions were made by a military bureaucratic elite, including crucially decisions over the economy, decisions over what was invested and what was produced, and how commercial interactions and so on. In fact, the basic decisions are at the core of any society, surely any modern society. They were out of the public arena entirely. And that had a lot of consequences. One consequence was that information was quite narrowly controlled by the very same hands, namely by those who had the resources and the power to impose decisions on how they were used. Now, side comment, the population of the Soviet Union apparently had very wide access to information and used that access. There were interesting studies done by U.S. government-funded studies by Russian research centers and others in the 1970s who concluded that it appeared that about over three-quarters of the population was listening regularly to foreign broadcasts, and about 95% of the more or less educated sectors of the population. Samizdat, underground newspapers, technically illegal, but all over the place, they were read by about half of the relatively educated part of the population and by about 15% of blue-collar workers, according to these studies. Those are phenomenal figures for dissident literature, incomparably beyond anything that we can imagine. Returning to the reasons why we laugh at Soviet people's democracies, another was that there was very little in the way of popular organizations that were able to function in the political sphere. Public participation in proposing or crafting, formulating public policy was extremely slight, and there weren't any organizational structures around that enabled people to take part in it. And finally, most people were so busy just trying to survive that they were unable to participate in any meaningful way in the public arena and wouldn't have been able to even if opportunities had existed. Under such conditions, democracy is at best a very thin reed. Well, you'll have noticed, I'm sure, that I'm describing our society. The basic point, the crucial point about the concentration of resources and decision-making power is not quite the same as in the Soviet Union. Basic decision-making here, too, is out of the public arena, in fact, entirely out of it almost. But it's not in the hands of a military bureaucratic elite. It's in the hands of private power, corporations, financial institutions, and the like, which operate in secret without any public scrutiny, virtually any, and essentially no public input. They're almost completely unaccountable. And in fact, they determine the basic things that happen in life. They are now increasingly transnational. As it's been the case over a long period that governing structures things that become governments, tend to coalesce around concentrations of power in the last couple of centuries. That means primarily economic power. So national economies led to and were integrated with national governments. The rapid escalation of transnational corporations, banking institutions, financial institutions, and so on. Around them, there is also coalescing a network of structures of governance. What the world's leading business newspaper, the London Financial Times, describes it as a de facto world government with its own institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the new World Trade Organization, the GATT, the G7 the executive branches of the 7 rich countries. That's a kind of a framework of world government, what they call a de facto world government, that also operates very remotely, in secret, without scrutiny, without accountability. Its primary constituents are, in fact, precisely the transnational corporations and the financial institutions, and it reflects their interest. The new trade agreements, which is a rather misleading term in my opinion, but the trade agreements are accelerating this transfer of effective power to these absolutist, unaccountable institutions, now on a vast scale. Corporations themselves are absolutist institutions. Power lies in the hands of owners and managers. The only debate is about how that's how you divvy out the shares. Debate in literature about that. There's a fairly strict authority structure in a corporation. An individual can sometimes enter into the hierarchy, which means you essentially take orders from above and transfer orders down below. It's a fairly strict hierarchy, as much as any we know of in any institution. If you're an outsider, you're not part of it, you have basically nothing to say. You're allowed to rent yourself to it. That's called getting a job. You can buy what they sell if you like. You can watch. You can't see very much because they operate mostly in secret. And now that they're remote enough to be transnational and have their governing institutions in Brussels and Geneva and so on, they are even more operating in secret. Actually, this is all well-known and old stuff. I was at about 10 years ago, I was at a conference in Switzerland on international affairs, and one of the participants was a Swiss diplomatic historian. In fact, he told me he was the Swiss diplomatic historian from the University of Geneva. We got kind of friendly, and we were out having a beer or something one night, and he told me that the worst job in the world is to be a Swiss diplomatic historian. And the reason for that is quite simple. Diplomatic historians are people who look at archival materials primarily. They try to figure out what's going on by looking at the archives. Well, in most countries, there's a sort of a buffer between private power, which basically rules, and policy. The buffer is called the government. And you can look at and governments do leave a kind of a paper trail. And we're pretty good in that respect by comparative standards. So, you wait 30, 35 years and sometimes even earlier, and you get some kind of a record, in fact, often quite an interesting and complete record of what the government was up to. But in Switzerland, they don't bother with the buffer. The corporations just rule straight. So they make the decisions, the banks and the transnationals and so on, and corporations don't leave any paper trail at all. They are secret societies. They are secret absolutist organizations. If you learn anything about them, it's because, the multinational operations committee in Congress in the mid-'70s, under the pressure of the popular movements of the '60s, in fact, got subpoena power and released some information about them, and occasionally you find something out in other ways, but basically you learn nothing. So being a Swiss diplomatic historian without this kind of intervening level leaves you with not a lot to do, he was complaining. Well, we have something to do because there is this transmission belt, but the picture is, it's not all that different if you think about it. If you think about where power actually is, how decisions are made, and how much you can find out about the centers of power. Well, this has its consequences, naturally. For example, the other aspects of the deficiencies of democracy, I can't even use the word, the absurdity of using the term democracy to refer to the Soviet system of tyranny. In various respects, we also have the same features. Information is very narrowly concentrated in pretty much the same hands as other decision-making. The major media are just huge corporations selling, people like you selling audiences to other businesses, to advertisers. And that sets the framework within which most of the rest operates. Actually, we have, it's a different information system and all sorts of different properties. One of the properties is that people here have much less access. They have access. They don't seek access to other sources of information. So the proportion of the population here that listens to foreign broadcasts is minuscule. And publications that are outside the very narrow and rigid ideological framework reach statistically insignificant part of the population, nothing like, say, Soviet Samizdat. There are reasons for that, and they're interesting ones, but again, that's another topic. With regard to popular organizations that permit the people to function in the political sphere, there's very limited. We don't have functioning political parties. We don't have political clubs. There's very little in that way, and furthermore, most people are indeed so busy trying to survive that even if such organizations existed, and even if information were readily available, there'd be a limited amount that they could do with it. And under such conditions, again, democracy is a fairly thin reed. I don't want to suggest that here it's like under Soviet tyranny, but some of the structural properties are quite similar and worth thinking about. These are the kinds of reasons why classical Democrats and libertarians were so hostile to corporate power. Now, they didn't really see it. They were on the classical period. I mean, people like Thomas Jefferson, they were only witnessing the very early incipient moments of what was going on, but enough to see it and not to like it. So Thomas Jefferson in 1816 expressed his fear that the country, I'm quoting him now, that the country was moving toward a single and splendid government of an aristocracy founded on banking institutions and moneyed in corporations. And if that tendency, which was just beginning, continued, he said, it would be the end of democracy and freedom. The few would be riding and ruling over the plundered plowman and the beggared yeomanry. Well, that was 1816. A decade later, period of Jacksonian democracy, Jefferson was a little more optimistic. Right before his death, in fact, I think hours before his death, he spoke at the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And in speaking there, he made a crucial distinction, which is worth paying careful attention to. He distinguished, I'll use his words, between those who fear and distrust the people and wish to draw all powers from them into the hands of the higher classes. That's one category. And the others are those who identify with the people, have confidence in them, cherish and consider them as the most honest and safe depository of the public interest, even though not the most wise. That's the second category of people. And he was hoping that the second category would be in the ascendancy. Well, looking now, that was 1826, it's clear, should be clear to any observer, that Thomas Jefferson's worst fears have been realized. Effective power is indeed in the hands of the higher classes. The early institutions of banking institutions and moneyed in corporations that he was concerned about are now vast in power and control and dominate the decision-making system, essentially in secret. And modern democratic theory, interestingly, has veered very sharply from Jeffersonian ideas, and in fact is precisely based on fear and distrust of the people, who must not be allowed to determine public policy or enter into the public arena because, as contemporary thinkers put it, they are too stupid and ignorant. They agree with Jefferson only on one point, that the people are perhaps not the most wise, but they disagree with him on everything else. And that's rather important. I'll return to that. Well, if we go back earlier, say half a century earlier, to Adam Smith, he was describing a world that is very different from ours, so much so that the descriptions and the explanations really don't carry over very well, but the ideas do. He lived too early to see the autocratic structures of modern industrial capitalism, and he didn't anticipate their development. But he was already, at that period, very much opposed to joint stock companies, what we nowadays call corporations. And he was particularly opposed to them if, as he feared might happen, they would become personified and made permanent. That is, they would gain the status of immortal persons, in effect, with all the rights of persons except immortal. And that, in fact, is exactly what happened in the 19th century. If you look at one of the major parts of American 19th century history is the creation of corporate power by government decision and the turning corporations, which used to be sort of public interest groups, like build a bridge or something, into immortal persons with the rights of persons, which if you have corporate power means vast rights, well beyond any real person. That didn't happen through the democratic process. Actually, it happened primarily through judicial decision by lawyers and judges and so on, as part of the effort to create a developmental state, a powerful interventionist state that would introduce a high level of protectionism and direct public resources to private power, and in that way enable development to take place. And so that's the only way in history that development has ever taken place, from England up to South Korea and Taiwan, and there's some lessons there too. The prescriptions that contemporary economic ideologues, whatever you want to call them, offer to underdeveloped societies have the interesting property that they are refuted 100% of the time. If you can find one case in history of a society that's developed by those rules or even marginally using them, it'd be interesting to hear about it. Nobody's come up with one yet. There are cases of societies that have followed those rules, and they're mostly basket cases. Again, something worth looking at when you read primers on free trade and so on the front pages of the New York Times. Well, again, that's that other topic I'm not talking about. The judiciary in the 19th century did create the permanent, the immortal persons that Adam Smith was so concerned about. And again, his worst fears were realized. Adam Smith, though, again, it's a very different world that he was describing, and the arguments don't. You could argue about whether they went through for his world, but they don't go through for ours. Nevertheless, the ideas are interesting, and the beliefs, and worth paying attention to. This is part of the system of classical liberal thought, the basis for modern libertarian theories of freedom and democracy. He held that markets could function properly only under conditions of relative equality. And he also thought, and gave a long argument to try to show, that liberty would lead to equality. Either to perfect liberty would lead either to absolute equality or to continual tendencies toward equality. And insofar as we don't attain that state of equality, or near equality, insofar as that's not realized, that simply indicates that we've not attained the state of liberty, of perfect liberty. Well, of course, the discrepancies are vast and growing, and that gives you a measure of how far we are from liberty in any sense that someone like Adam Smith would have recognized. He held, in fact, that only under conditions of relative equality and tendencies toward equality would market competition be efficient or fair, and thus able to contribute to its further ends. The market was no end in itself for people like Adam Smith. The further ends were a realization of human capacities and potentialities, and a market could contribute to those ends insofar it was relatively equal, as the outcomes were relatively equal, and that he thought would happen under conditions of liberty. Otherwise, you don't have liberty. The very foundation of liberty in Adam Smith's view, and this is standard Enlightenment thinking, is the right of every workman to the fruits of his own labor. That, he said, is sacred and inviolable. It's a crucial element in self-fulfillment, as another major classical liberal thinker, Wilhelm von Humboldt, who's very much inspired John Stuart Mill, as he put it, if a craftsman creates something beautiful, but does it on external command by the orders of someone else and under coercion, we may admire what he does, but we will despise what he is, because he's not human, he's a machine. Adam Smith held the same view. Coming to the present, John Dewey, who again was one of the increasingly lone voices speaking for democracy and freedom in the 20th century, 20th century America, though he was very much surely in the mainstream intellectual and political culture of his day. That's the first half of the 20th century, increasingly marginalized. By now his views are almost unrecognizable. He held, let me just read them, and I'm reading it because I think it's basically correct, incidentally. His views, and it should be a vision for the future, as it was a vision of the great libertarians of the past. He held that politics is the shadow in our society, politics is the shadow cast on society by big business. And as long as that is so, the attenuation of the shadow will not change the substance. In other words, reforms are basically pointless. The reason is that a democracy requires that the shadow of big business simply be removed so that the political system can function. The very institutions of private power, he stressed, undermine freedom and democracy. And he was very explicit about the anti-democratic power that he was talking about. Quote Dewey, it resides in control of the means of production, exchange, publicity, transportation, and communication. Whoever owns them rules the life of the country, even if under democratic forms, acting within the shadow that big business casts. Business for private profit through private control of banking, land, industry, reinforced by command of the press agents, and other means of publicity and propaganda. That, he said, is the system of actual power, the source of coercion, and unless it's unraveled, we cannot seriously talk about democracy or freedom. Continuing in a free or democratic society, workers have to be masters of their own industrial fate. That's a classical liberal doctrine. Find it right through classical liberalism. Adam Smith, Humboldt, and the rest. Thomas Jefferson, of course. It is illiberal and immoral, Dewey said, to train children to work for the sake of the wage earned, not freely and intelligently, under their own control. Hence, industry must be changed. If democracy is to exist, it must be changed from a feudalistic to a democratic social order. All of these are, or at least should be, truisms. And indeed, they were very common coin. They were common ideas among working people, uneducated working people, not all that long ago, turn of the century, for example, when working people called for an end to what was standardly called wage slavery, which they regarded as not very different from chattel slavery. I stress that all of this is as American as apple pie. It has nothing to do with Marxism, nothing to do with Leninism, or any of the other scare words that are conceived by concocted by the contemporary commissars. And it's all completely down the tube. As the system has become more feudalistic, in Dewey's sense, more fundamentally illiberal, and more opposed to the ideals of human freedom that were held, and indeed rightly held, by classical libertarians, those who we profess to honor, but in fact constantly kick in the face, and whose ideas are simply disappearing from sight. The doctrinal, as the system has itself become more feudalistic, absolutist, unaccountable, narrow, remote, secret, in essentially the classical liberal sense, running right up to Dewey and others of the time. As it's become narrower, the doctrinal system has also correspondingly become narrower. That's what universities are about, in fact, to narrow it and to exclude the thinking that, in fact, inspired classical liberalism and democratic action and thought. The fundamental libertarian principles, which, as I say, were even common coin among the general population, let alone libertarian thinkers, these now sound very exotic and extreme. I just gave you a sample of them. In fact, they're often called anti-American, an interesting term, actually, a term that can be used only in cultures with a really deep totalitarian strain. So, for example, in the Soviet Union, the worst crime was being anti-Soviet. And in the United States, people like professors at the University of Massachusetts publish books called The Anti-Americans, which people don't laugh about. They're highly regarded, and you get sober reviews in the New York Times and so on and so forth. You might ask yourself, as a sort of a thought experiment, what would happen if somebody, say in Italy, were to publish a book called The Anti-Italians, and imagine, or anti-Italianism, or anti-Norwegianism or something, and ask what the reaction would be on the streets of Milan or Oslo, or in fact any culture, any political culture that had not succumbed to totalitarian doctrine and still had a memory of what freedom and democracy were about. The very fact that we're able to use terms like that is quite striking, particularly if you consider our own history, of which I've just barely given a sample, but it's a real sample, not of major figures. Well, these are very important features of the deterioration of democracy in the current period, not only at the institutional level, but also in the doctrinal support for power that accompanies it. I ought to stress that this fear of democracy is a very old story and very deep-seated, because the first modern democratic revolution was in England in the 17th century, and the popular democratic forces were bitterly condemned for seeking, as leading intellectuals of the day put it, for seeking to raise the rascal multitude against the men of best quality, and for making the people so curious and so arrogant that they will not submit to a civil rule. There was a civil war going on, as you learned in high school, between king and parliament, but what often isn't taught is that the rabble, the rascal multitude, were opposed to both sides in the Civil War. Their pamphlets said that they did not want to be ruled by king or parliament, rather, as they put it, by countrymen like ourselves that know our wants and know the people's sores. Incidentally, that same call was reiterated by rebellious farmers right here after the American Revolution, when they learned that they would continue to be ruled by the men of best quality, not by countrymen like themselves, as the revolutionary pamphlets had claimed. We're back to the distinction that Thomas Jefferson drew in 1826 that I quoted earlier. Actually, that's true of every social upheaval and revolution, at least to my knowledge. The official story is there are two sides fighting. The reality, quite typically, is that there are three sides. The two sides that are officially fighting one another for a share of the power, or all of it, and then the general population, which wants to be free of both of them, and quite often gets crushed. That, I think, if you look, is the real history of social upheaval and revolution, including the American Revolution, if you look closely. Well, over the time, the rabble have won rights. They've won rights through struggle. They're not gifts from above. The rights include, for example, the franchise, the right to vote. And that brought, which is expanded. So in the United States, half the population was disenfranchised until the 1920s, for example, but it finally won the vote. And in the 1960s, the vote extended effectively to black population, which hadn't really had it before. So these are all victories for democracy. It extends the franchise, extends something. And those victories brought with them renewed fears of the rascal multitude and new and more sophisticated devices to control and marginalize them. Now, as the power of the state to coerce gradually declined over the years, these modes of coercion and control and marginalization shifted more and more to propaganda. And propaganda is naturally in the hands of the powerful, for surprising reasons. In our own business-run autocracies, that means primarily business propaganda, and that includes media propaganda, the media just being big businesses. That's a huge phenomenon, some of it direct, like what comes out of the public relations industry in American creation. Not surprising in a uniquely business-run society with a highly class-conscious business community that is always fighting a bitter class war and it knows it. So straight out of the public relations industry and then out through its various outlets, including a good part of the media and the academic profession and so on. The leading student of 20th century of business propaganda, an Australian, Alex Carey, who's written very interesting things about the United States and is unknown here. He opened some of his work with the following comment, which I think is quite accurate. He says, the 20th century has been characterized by three developments of great political importance. The first is the growth of democracy. The second is the growth of corporate power. And the third is the growth of corporate propaganda as a means of protecting corporate power against democracy. Now, that's quite right. And that's, in fact, the new version of the methods of the fear of the rascal multitude and the methods of controlling them. And we see that if we look at recent American history. So start with, say, the First World War, which was important. The First World War taught quite important lessons in this regard. Woodrow Wilson created the first official government propaganda agency, Creel Commission, designed to try to drive what was in fact a very pacifist country into war. He was particularly aided by the people who modestly called themselves the most intelligent members of the society, the liberal intellectuals, who took pride in the fact that for the first time in history, a population had been driven into war not by generals and other rotten people, but by the smart guys who perceived that it was the right thing to do. In fact, what they were doing was disseminating fabrications concocted by the British Ministry of Information about, Belgian babies with their arms ripped off and various other propaganda that was designed by the British, as they put it, to try to control the thought of the world. Well, the ones that they were most easily able to control were the most intelligent members of the society here, self-designated, namely the serious intellectuals who propounded all of this stuff with great sobriety and later took great credit for what they'd achieved. Whoever owns this is going to get a bit of silence. This was quite successful, this business propaganda, and it impressed people. Woodrow Wilson himself was called the great generalissimo of the propaganda, on the propaganda front, a phrase that was used by Harold Lasswell, one of the leading figures in contemporary political science, the founder of the modern field of communications and so on, who began a very influential career by studying wartime propaganda. The success of the Generalissimo was substantial, and it impressed several audiences. One audience that it impressed was the most important one, the American business community. It gave a big shot in the arm to the public relations industry, which had existed, but it really took off, very much influenced by the successes of the Generalissimo. In fact, the Generalissimo of corporate propaganda, Edward Bernays, who lived here, was part of the was in the Wilson propaganda agency, and he learned a lot from it. He developed the ideas, which he later propounded, which were that the essence of democracy is propaganda, what he sometimes called the engineering of consent. And it's quite obvious who's going to do the engineering, but though obvious, unsaid, because that's not one of the things you're supposed to say. Another person who was quite impressed by the successes of Anglo-American propaganda was Adolf Hitler. If you read Mein Kampf, you'll notice that he thinks Germany's defeat in the First World War was in large part due to the inability of autocratic, authoritarian Germany to compete on the propaganda front with the democratic societies, which really carried out thought control much more efficiently and effectively. He's actually quite right about that. And in Mein Kampf, he sort of promised next time around, they'd have their own propaganda agencies. Whether they succeeded equally to ours or not, is another question, but again, we'll put that one aside. A third audience that was deeply impressed were American intellectuals, people like Harold Lasswell, for example. They were not particularly cognizant of the fact that they were the main victims of the propaganda. That sort of was true, but you don't want to think that about yourself. Lasswell was the author, for example, of in the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences in 1933 or 34, he was the author of an important article called Propaganda. In those days, people were a little more honest. We don't use the term now. We use other terms journalism or something like that. But in those days, they were pretty straight. It was called propaganda. And he recognized that propaganda is necessary in any society, and more necessary in a society that's more free. The logic is sort of obvious. If you can control people with a whip, you don't really care all that much what they think. I think that's probably part of the reason why the Soviet Union wasn't very repressive with regard to, say, samizdat and foreign broadcasts. They were to an extent, but nowhere near what they could have been, because it really didn't matter all that much. You got to bludgeon over people's heads. Here it matters a lot more what people think, so propaganda has to be far more sophisticated and much more intensive, as Lasswell and others realized. Propaganda, he wrote back in the 1930s, is a new technique of control of the general public, who are a threat because of what he called the ignorance and stupidity of the masses. And we must not, he said, succumb to democratic dogmatisms about men being the best judges of their own interests. We are the best judges. That you'll recognize from the two alternatives that Jefferson counterposed in 1826. I won't reread them, but notice that Jefferson's worst fears became the credo of the modern liberal intellectuals. In fact, of the intellectual community rather generally. Bolshevism is a subcase of this. Not very different if you think it through. A fact which was long noted by libertarian, by anarchist thinkers, and in fact predicted by Bakunin long before the Bolshevik Revolution. He predicted that there'd be two forms of modern intellectuals, what he called the red bureaucracy, who would use popular struggles to try to take control of state power and institute the most vicious and ruthless dictatorships in history. And the other group who would see that there isn't going to be an access to power that way and would therefore become the servants of private power and state capitalist democracy, where they would, as Bakunin put it, beat the people with the people's stick. You know, talk about democracy, but beat the people with it. That's actually one of the few predictions in the social sciences that's come true, to my knowledge, and a pretty perceptive one. Well, that's the credo of 20th century intellectual life to quite a remarkable extent, and it shows how much we have declined since Jefferson's day. Jefferson was hoping that the alternative would turn out to be true. This is what did turn out to be true, his worst fears. This should be part of intellectual history in a free society. It's the kind of thing you ought to learn in elementary school. Jefferson's distinction applies with precision to the modern age, except everything has been reversed and forgotten. Well, this is also pretty standard in the academic culture. So, for example, the president of the American Political Science Association in 1934, Harold Gosnell, in his presidential address, advised, this is right in the period of the big ferment in the Depression, remember, you know, worker struggles, everybody uprising. He said that we must, I'm quoting him, exclude the ignorant, the uninformed, and antisocial elements from the political arena. That's almost everybody, if you look at what he's talking about. What we need is an aristocracy. We need an aristocracy of intellect and character. The men of brains must seize the torch, you know, the action intellectuals of the Kennedy period, for example. Now, there's an unspoken assumption in all of this, unspoken and possibly unnoticed, since it's not nice to see yourself in a mirror. The unspoken assumption is that we can seize the torch, these guys can seize the torch insofar as they keep well within the shadow that's cast by big business that we call politics. If they move a little bit beyond that shadow or even to its margins, they forfeit their place within the aristocracy of intellect and character. Well, as I say, that's not much discussed, though an obvious truth. The leading thinker, the leading exponent of these doctrines, and one of the most influential ones, was Walter Lippmann, who was the leading figure in American journalism for half a century, major commentator on foreign affairs, and also a highly regarded called progressive political theorist. His view, he made a distinction between what he called the responsible men, very small number. He was, of course, one of them. Everyone who presents the views is always within the group of the men of best quality and, you know, the aristocracy of intellect and character and so on. So there's the responsible men on the one side, and then there's the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, who are the population. Now, it's a democracy, so the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders have a role or a function, as he put it. Their function in a democracy is to be spectators, not participants. But they are allowed to, as he put it, lend their weight periodically to one or another member of the responsible men, the men of best quality. That's called an election. And then they're supposed to go home and, you know, watch the Super Bowl or whatever the equivalent was in the 1920s. I'm talking about the center. This is the liberal, pragmatic mainstream. There's the spectrum extends in both directions. Toward the more libertarian end, it extends in his day, for example, to John Dewey with his roots in classical liberalism. Toward the more reactionary end, it includes pretty much the mainstream business community, which has enormous fear of the rascal multitude and has its explicit political representatives, for example, say both in the political system and the ideological sphere, the Reaganites, the people who are funding those journals that Archon or somebody mentioned before. Their view is that the population shouldn't even be spectators. That's too much. They should be completely outside. That's one reason why the Reaganites were so committed to protecting an increasingly powerful state, because they were statist reactionaries. They believed in an extremely powerful and interventionist state intervening in the economy and overseas, but it should also be protected. So they instituted unprecedented censorship, the first government propaganda agency since Wilson, this time illegal because laws had changed. They went for clandestine operations, big, as you know, huge clandestine operations, reached new peaks. Clandestine operations are operations undertaken targeting the domestic population. Everybody else knows about them. It's just the domestic population that doesn't. That's the respect in which they're clandestine. There are very interesting counterparts to this in corporate propaganda. I'll read you a couple examples if you're interested. They're kind of interesting to look at, rather well crafted, but I'll put aside time being tight. Well, that's basically the spectrum. At the libertarian end, you have extremists like Thomas Jefferson and Adam Smith and John Dewey. That end has been pretty much sawed off. On the rest of it is the spectrum lies between, say, the generalissimo of propaganda and his administration. That's kind of like the center, Lippmann, Bernays, Lasswell, the concept of engineered consent and elite control. And then you go all the way off to the right, like, for example, the Reaganites, who don't think even the spectator role is too much. I mean, they're basically Stalinists, adapted to our political system. Well, the end of World War I, the generalissimo had some work to do. There was a lot of ferment. There was labor organizing, strikes, political thought, and so on. That had to be squashed. So the liberal Wilson administration conducted a very violent and repressive Red Scare with the support of the liberal press and so on. And that worked quite well. It led to a decade of quiescence and subordination to business control. And that's when these mainstream views of the Lippmann, Lasswell type, Bernays type flourished. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the quiescence broke. People became active again and thoughtful, entered the political arena, began to organize, actually won some victories. In 1935, labor finally won the rights that European labor had won half a century before, namely the Wagner Act, the right to organize. Now that victory for working people and democracy sent a real chill through the business community. The National Association of Manufacturers, the major business association, in its publications described the hazard facing industrialists in the newly realized political power of the masses and said this must be reversed and their thinking directed to more proper channels or we are definitely headed for adversity. And they indeed began a huge corporate propaganda offensive to block this incipient threat of democracy and human rights. The World War came along and put it on hold for a while, but right after the war it took off. Huge corporate propaganda offensives. That's one of the reasons why the United States is essentially off the spectrum of industrial societies on things like health and social contract and labor rights and so on. The right to organize was essentially destroyed by 1948, and by then the game was pretty much over. This is incidentally all pre-McCarthy. McCarthy was a kind of a latecomer. This was led by a spectrum of liberal Democrats attacking independent thought and people a little further over to the right, undermining unions and social policy and so on. McCarthy sort of picked it up and turned it into something obscene, but it was bad enough before, and essentially was all over by the late 40s. The labor victories were reversed, and there was a major attack on independent thought. That led to the 50s, which were very quiescent, rather similar to the 1920s. Incidentally, there's been a recurrent pattern through American history. Democratizing tendencies, repression, and quiescence, and then things blow up again. At that time, there was a lot of new technology that helped, and that has a lot of bearing on the present day. So in the 1920s and the 1930s, radio was coming into existence. Radio, everybody recognized as a public resource. It's not like shoes. There's a fixed band that's going to be government regulated. Everyone knew that. The question was, where will it go? Will radio be assigned to the public interest, meaning public radio, hence democratic to the extent that the society is democratic? And that's one option. The other option is just handed over to private absolute power and turned into a device for propaganda and profit-making by the private sector. Well, just about every country in the world, maybe everyone, I don't offhand know of an exception, went the first way towards making it a public resource. The United States went the second way, became a private monopoly, virtual monopoly. I mean, like a college radio station could have a little station that you could hear for 3 blocks away or something. But this issue was struggled about. Labor groups, church groups, other public interest groups sought to put the United States within the mainstream of Western society, and they lost. They lost flat out. That's a reflection of a lot of other things, the extent to which we are indeed an unusual society with a highly class-conscious business community, always fighting a vicious class war, and very well aware of it. These quotes that I read from the National Association of Manufacturers are quite typical. Okay, that was radio. By the time television came along, it wasn't even an issue. The world went one way, the United States went the other way. That's coming along right today. We're right in the middle of it with the question of this, information highway business. Again, there's a question. Is it going to be a public interest resource serving a democratizing function, as the technology certainly allows, or is it simply going to become another instrument of corporate power and corporate propaganda and thought control and concocting artificial wants and so on and so forth? And the answer to that depends on the balance of forces. The way things now stand, you can predict it's just going to be another instrument of thought control and corporate power, but it doesn't have to be. These are questions of how people react. Other countries, not very different from us, in fact, very much like us, went the other way with radio and television, and we could have too. It's a question of organizing and activism and awareness. One of the reasons for the intensive propaganda is to keep people from thinking about these things. To some extent, it succeeded. The 50s were quiescent, very much like the 1920s. The 60s, it broke again, rather like the 1930s. There was a lot of ferment, and it aroused the usual fear. Ever since then, from the early 70s, there has been a major attempt to carry out another Red Scare case, essentially, to beat back the population to conformity and quiescence. It's kind of interesting that this time it hasn't worked. That's one of maybe the first time in American history where the cycle hasn't really worked out. A rather interesting phenomenon with a lot of consequences. Again, not much time to talk about it. But that's what we're right in the middle of. The new slogan in the early 70s is what was called by the liberals the crisis of democracy. As the chairman of the political science department over at Harvard put it, the Eaton professor of the science of government. I love that title. Speaking for the science of government, he deplored the crisis of democracy, the fact that societies were becoming ungovernable, essentially because the rabble was trying to enter the public arena, and that made it ungovernable. Unspoken in all of these discussions is that somebody is allowed into the public arena. Who? Well, not allowed to say that bad word, but the public are not allowed in. Samuel Huntington almost gave it away. He kind of referred nostalgically to the Truman administration period when Truman, as he put it, had been able to govern the country with the help of a few Wall Street lawyers and financiers. Well, that that's a little kind of on the vulgar Marxist side, and it wasn't quite that, but you get the idea. Sort of had the general idea correct. In those days, there was no crisis of democracy. That's exactly the way things were supposed to be. But now there's been a crisis. Women and blacks and young people and old people and farmers and all these bad types were trying to enter the public arena to press their demands, and that just made the society ungovernable. It had been fine under, when you had a couple of Wall Street lawyers and financiers doing it. Well, that's the struggle we're right in the middle of. The efforts to restore passivity have been a mixed success, not completely by any means. We're right in the middle of it now, and the lines that are drawn are the usual ones, quite currently, in fact. Take, say, the NAFTA debate. It's very revealing in this respect. The NAFTA debate, the big issue toward the end of the NAFTA was a major issue for the corporate world. Such a major issue that the media, which usually kind of pretend to be above the struggle, abandoned the pretense, and their class commitments became very explicit. In fact, the New York Times actually used the phrase class lines at one point. That's like a no-no. You're not allowed to refer to that. But it was just too obvious to conceal, as were the commitments of the media. There was a real frenzy about NAFTA, unusual, in fact. And that tells you that something really important was at stake, as it was. A lot of what was important was the attack on democracy, in fact, which is accelerated by these so-called trade agreements. You recall right at the end, when it looked like not such a clear thing, the frenzy mounted to a fever pitch, and it focused on one thing primarily, the fact that labor, working people, were attempting to lobby their representatives. And that was considered an absolute scandal. Clinton made all kinds of speeches, which were headlined all over the place, in which he denounced what he called the naked pressure and the raw muscle of labor. which even descended to pleading based on friendship and threatening based on money and work and campaigns, total outrage, to approach your representatives and say, look, we'd like you to do something. This went all the way over to what's considered the left in the media. So say take Anthony Lewis, who's about as far out as you can imagine, still be in respectable society. He denounced what he called the backward, unenlightened labor movement with its crude, threatening tactics and its fear of change and so on. The whole thing was real hysteria. And it was quite interesting. New York Times last day had an editorial, which had in it a box in which they listed people in the New York area who were planning to vote against NAFTA, and they listed their contributions from labor. They said this is kind of ominous, raises serious questions about whether they're being honest and so on and so forth. Well, Washington Post did the same thing. That was interesting. Now, as everybody knew, but didn't say until afterwards when they sort of came clean on it, in fact, they came clean the day after the vote, corporate lobbying was hugely greater than labor lobbying, by an overwhelming factor, as always. And nobody worried about that. They weren't having crude, threatening tactics and all this bad stuff. And there's a good reason for that. Corporate lobbying is not a problem. They are the men of best quality. They are the ones who are supposed to rule. And the responsible intellectuals are their good and loyal servants. So therefore, there's nothing to say about corporate lobbying. We don't object to it. It's when the rascal multitude tries to get in the act that everyone begins to foam at the mouth. They're supposed to submit in silence to the rule of the aristocracy of wealth, and of course the aristocracy of intellect and character, us smart guys who do their work for them. Actually, very little has changed since the 17th century. If you look at the hysteria in the 17th century, among 17th century intellectuals, which I just gave a couple of quotes from, a lot more elsewhere if you like, it reads very similarly to the hysteria today. Say if working people dare, to lobby their representatives. And the reason it's the same is the issues are the same. You can call it a new world order if you like, but it's the same class war, and intellectuals are playing the same service role, the ones who are within the shadow cast by big business, that is, and therefore granted respectability. Departures from this do exist, but they're very slight. All of this helps to explain the enthusiasm for NAFTA and GATT, which the primary thing about them is that they vest far more power in private absolutist institutions, which are completely unaccountable to the public and operate in secret, spawning the de facto world government that the business press openly talks about. And all of that moves us toward, going back to that spectrum on democracy, this moves us toward the reactionary end, the Reaganite end, in which the population are not even spectators. Insofar as power is shifted to the transnational arena with its own de facto world government, you're not even a spectator, because only the most real experts and specialists have any idea, say, what's going on in the IMF or something like that. Well, that's a great achievement in the destruction of democracy, and that helps explain the tremendous enthusiasm for NAFTA and GATT and other such profoundly anti-democratic developments, also anti-market developments, but as I say, that's another story. Finally, just a couple of words on how this stuff works out in our dependencies. Sometimes it's described with considerable candor. Actually, one of the clearest voices these days is a former Reaganite insider, a man named Thomas Carruthers, who was part of the democracy enhancement programs, as they were called, within the State Department in the 1980s. These were hailed with great pride. That makes us, the beacon of the future and all that sort of business. He's written a book and a couple articles about this, and they're informative and honest, rather rueful. He says that the policies were sincere, but he thinks they failed. On the contrary, in my opinion, they succeeded quite brilliantly. But putting aside that judgment, what he describes is entirely accurate. It's just interesting to have it said from the inside. He points out that there was a correlation between democracy in the hemisphere and U.S. influence, namely a negative correlation. Where U.S. influence was least, the steps toward democracy were greatest, primarily in the southern cone of Latin America. Whereas he points out, speaking from the inside, the Reagan administration strongly opposed the moves towards democracy, tried to back the autocratic governments, which are in fact a residue of the Kennedy liberals, I should say, who were very close to the Reaganites in their picture of the world, remarkably close. The Reagan administration sought to preserve these kind of neo-Nazi states of the Southern Cone, but they failed, and there was a democracy. And then, of course, they took credit for what had happened afterwards. That, in fact, happened all over the place. Where U.S. influence was the greatest in Central America and the Caribbean, the effects were worst. He recognizes that, doesn't draw any conclusions from it, but in fact it's something that generalizes on human rights as well. Another one of those lessons you're not supposed to learn. He then points out what happened. Here's his description from the inside. Washington's, which he opposes, and so I think it's a bad thing, you know, but he says, Washington sought only limited top-down forms of democratic change that did not risk upsetting the traditional structures of power with which the United States has long been allied. It sought to maintain the basic order of quite undemocratic societies because of the deep fear of populist-based change with all its implications for upsetting established economic and political orders and heading off in a leftist direction. Well, what's a leftist direction? That's a direction that holds, to quote some leftist extremists, that holds that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride them. It is the view that we should oppose a single and splendid government founded on banking institutions and moneyed in corporations. I'm quoting that leftist extremist Thomas Jefferson in the early days of the corporate state capitalist absolutism that he despised and feared and that has come into existence. Well, Carruthers is quite correct. His picture of what happened is accurate, generalizes very broadly, applies at home as well. It's the key to understanding policy. Again, these are truths that would be taught in elementary school in a free society. Major efforts have to be made in the educational system, right up to the elite universities, to prevent people from seeing that 2 + 2 = 4, but that's the answer. It does. And it's not very hard to figure out. If you look not even very profoundly, you see it all over the place, and it's quite systematic. The policy is that the traditional structures of power must remain, and they have to be protected, in his words, from the populist-based changes. That's true abroad, and that's true at home. Democracy is a fine thing, but only if it has the right outcome. Democracy is defined not by process, but by outcome. The right guys have to win, otherwise it's not democracy. The right guys mean Thomas Jefferson's banking institutions and moneyed in corporations and their modern inheritors, and the aristocracy of intellect and character that serves them and labors to conceal the reality of the world from the rascal multitude. People like you, if you get properly trained. I mean, you have to be willing to accept the training, of course. And if you do, a lot of privilege and power comes with that submission to power. So, you know, advantages. Well, we can see the Thomas Carruthers thesis of the 1980s, which is just history, you know. It's just a chapter of history. We can see it right before our eyes today. In fact, it's playing itself out with really brilliant clarity right in front of us in Haiti. It couldn't be a clearer example. In Haiti, the United States made a mistake. We'd been supporting dictators and murderers and everything was all great, but there was a mistake. They allowed a free election. It was assumed that the U.S.-backed candidate, a World Bank official, would win easily, had all the resources and so on. But unknown to the men of best quality there and here, there had been a lot of ferment in Haiti. There's a lot of popular organizing. Big popular organizations had developed with nobody paying attention to them. They'd been very effective, and in fact, the wrong guy won with an overwhelming majority in the first free election in the history of the country, namely President Aristide, with 2/3 of the vote. Trouble is, it was the wrong 2/3 of the population. As it was described by America's Watch, the leading human rights group, he was swept into power by a remarkably advanced array of popular organizations that gave the vast majority of the population a share in local and national politics. Totally the wrong thing. Completely wrong from every point of view. Well, he was quickly overthrown by violence, and that was an end to Haiti's democracy, or as the New York Times put it in a headline right afterwards, Haiti's democracy such as it was. That contemptuous comment means not much, you know. We read regularly that President Aristide, and that just symbolically means the rabble that voted for him, President Aristide has meager democratic credentials. He is opposed by what the New York Times calls civil society, which fears that he supports class-based violence. He even blamed the rich for the poverty of the masses. It's an absolute outrage to tell the elementary truths in public, or maybe in secret somewhere, but not in public. That happens to be the New York Times, but it's standard. Again, pick at random. That's the story. So therefore, Aristide must broaden his government. That's the current phrase. Unlike Clinton, say, whose government is broad enough. Just sort of take a look at the average income in his cabinet. So that's broad enough. But Aristide must broaden his cabinet. That's code word, which everyone understands. It means he must broaden his cabinet to exclude the huge mass of the population, because they don't belong there. And he must extend it to the democratic elements, what are called the moderates in the military and the business community. Power has to be shifted into their hands. Who are the moderates? Well, the moderates are the ones who don't think everyone should just be exterminated. That's why they're moderates. Rather, they think that people should be allowed to work for 14 cents an hour in US-owned assembly plants, which incidentally is a very useful weapon against poor people at home and working people at home. It's a way to lower standards of living and wages throughout the world, and the rich society is an extremely important thing, so that's the moderates. Also, they're allowed to produce food for export. Right now, under Clinton, though I haven't seen any headlines about it, food exports from Haiti are increasing. This is a starving country, remember. Food exports are increasing, not by a small factor. They increased by a factor of 36 last year, 30, big number under Clinton, thanks to the liberal Democrats. That's fruits, nuts, citizens, melons from a starving island. That's for the benefit of U.S. agribusiness and yuppie markets. In fact, all trade with Haiti is increasing rather substantially under what is laughably called an embargo. The reason is because the embargo has an exception. It has an exception for U.S.-owned assembly plants. And when that's mentioned, it's always explained as a humanitarian gesture. You have to understand that Haitians suffer only when U.S.-owned plants don't export and import. When others don't export and import, they don't suffer. And also, like children in Cuba, fortunately, they don't suffer when they starve, so we don't have to worry about embargoes there. But we have to have a very carefully crafted embargo in Haiti, which excludes U.S.-owned assembly plants whose trade is increasing, in fact total trade is increasing, which allows export of food, which doesn't happen to notice that the Dominican border is completely porous, so the rich can get anything they feel like. The U.S. is totally impotent to stop the control the Dominican army, which it runs, the United States is known for having been able to exert influence at places, but not over superpower like the Dominican Republic, so we can't do anything about that. The Haitian military, as everyone knows, lives primarily on narco-trafficking. Take a look. The U.S. Navy and Coast Guard have been able to pick up just about every fishing boat that escapes Haiti with some terrified refugees. That's a totally illegal blockade, incidentally. It's as if Libya, say, were to block all commercial air traffic out of the United States. But we're a terrorist state, so we do what we feel like. But we've been able to pick up every refugee, just about, but not a single narco-trafficking boat. Amazing, isn't it? Actually, this was asked by the Black Caucus and John Conyers. Now, they got an answer. They said the problem in stopping narco-trafficking in Haiti is that the Haitian military, who we work with, still work with, don't have radar. So they can't pick up the planes and the boats. And of course, the U.S. Navy and Air Force, because of these terrible Pentagon budget cuts, they can't figure out a way to remedy this deficiency. So therefore, we just, what can we do? I mean, we'd like to stop it, but we can't. All this is going on. And the end result is perfectly predictable, and it was been predictable from the beginning. And for example, it was predictable when Warren Christopher, the Secretary of State, had his confirmation hearings. He was asked, if you looked at the small print, he was asked, what do you think about Haiti? New liberal Democrats coming in. And he said, we think that President Aristide definitely has a place in the final settlement, though we haven't quite determined yet what that place is. And with that ringing endorsement of democracy, the Clinton administration took over and has succeeded in harshening the policies of the Bush administration, which it attacked, including what I've just described. the end result is supposed to be that the government is to be broadened to include the moderates of the kind that I described. Aristide either doesn't get back at all or maybe gets back and has a kind of symbolic presence, which means that the population has a symbolic presence. Meanwhile, the population gets terrorized and intimidated. A year ago, when the Americans Watch report came out, they pointed out already, beginning in the Clinton term, that if this goes on, it won't matter much whether Aristide gets back or not. The popular organizations will have been decimated, people will be intimidated and terrified, and then you can even run a vote, like the way we're doing in El Salvador. And then it'll be fine. You know, if you intimidate and demoralize people enough, if you crush them, if you eliminate any hope, if you make it clear to them that if they get out of line, they're going to be slaughtered, then you can even run an election. And all the, you'll get Anthony Lewis to talk about this romantic era, like Thomas Jefferson, as he did after we succeeded in doing precisely that in Nicaragua. That's called democracy, and we're now watching it play out before our eyes in the case of Haiti. That formula that Carruthers described that's it. If after sufficient terror, intimidation, destruction of popular organizations, and so on, you can ensure that power stays in the hands of the right power groups, the ones linked up to U.S. corporations and banking institutions, the others who basically run this society, then that's democracy. And everybody's happy, and we praise ourselves for our glory. As I say, the same thing's going on in El Salvador right now. We saw it in Nicaragua. We're going to see it again. It has nothing to do with the Cold War. Zero. That was just a pretext for things that happened before and continue without change since. So what are the prospects for democracy? Well, again, that depends what we mean by democracy. If we mean what Thomas Jefferson hoped for, the prospects are gloomy and declining significantly. If we mean the official theory that's been taken over, that has in fact taken over our increasingly impoverished and authoritarian intellectual culture, if you believe that, well, then the prospects are just as grand as we're told every day by respectable authorities who sing odes to the New World Order, for which we, meaning they, are the gatekeepers in the model. Now that, of course, is not the whole story. The real prospects for authentic democracy depend on something else. They depend on how the people in the rich and the privileged societies learn some other lessons. For example, the lessons that are being taught right now by Mayans in Chiapas, Mexico. They're among the most impoverished and oppressed sectors in the continent, but unlike us, they retain a vibrant tradition of liberty and democracy, a tradition that we've allowed to slip out of our hands or simply be stolen from us. And unless people in the rich here and in other rich and privileged societies, unless they can recapture and revitalize that tradition, the prospects for democracy are indeed dim. Thanks.